10th of October, 1964, 2:15 in the afternoon. The air on Fifth Avenue didn't smell like Harlem. It didn't smell like the charcoal pits of 7th Avenue or the sweat of a crowded jazz club on 133rd. Out here, the air smelled like money, cold marble, and the kind of expensive French perfume that costs more than a working man's monthly rent. Inside a boutique so exclusive you needed a pedigree just to touch the silk, Mayme Johnson and her daughter Ruthie were looking at a coat. It was a simple afternoon of shopping, or it was supposed to be. But the silence of the store was suddenly shattered by a voice that sounded like gravel grinding into fine china. Charles Peton III, a man whose family name was etched into the very foundations of New York real estate, didn't see two women looking for a coat. He saw something he thought didn't belong on his side of town. He leaned in, his face turning a shade of sour red, and spat out words so vile, so thick with hatred, that the air in the room seemed to freeze. He called them names that should have stayed in the gutter, humiliating them in front of a dozen elite shoppers, who just turned their heads and pretended the carpet was suddenly very interesting. Mayme stood tall, her hand gripping Ruthie's shoulder, but the damage was done. In that moment, Peton thought he was just putting some people in their place. He didn't realize he had just signed the death warrant of his $45 million empire. He didn't know that the woman he just insulted was the Queen of Harlem. And more importantly, he didn't know that her husband was the most dangerous man in New York. Bumpy Johnson was about to show Charles Peton that in 1964, the world was changing, and some mistakes carry a price tag that no amount of old money can cover. But to understand the earthquake that was about to level Peton's world, you have to understand the man who triggered it. Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a gangster. By 1964, he was a living myth. He had just come home from Alcatraz, a man who had stared down the feds, the Italian mob, and the passage of time without ever bending his knee. He was the professor of Harlem, a man who read Shakespeare and played chess like a grandmaster, but could still open a man's throat with a flick of his wrist if the situation called for it. He was the protector of the neighborhood, the man who kept the peace and set the price of doing business. When Mayme and Ruthie walked through the door of their apartment that evening, Bumpy didn't need to ask if something was wrong. He could see it in the set of Mayme's jaw and the way Ruthie wouldn't look him in the eye. "Mayme," Bumpy said, his voice low and steady like a slow-moving river. "Tell me who did it." Mayme sat down, her voice trembling not from fear, but from the sheer indignity of it. It was at the boutique on Fifth, Ellsworth, a man. A big man with a silver cane, he said things. He said we didn't belong. He told the manager to throw the trash out. He used words I haven't heard since I left the South. Bumpy stood by the window looking out over the lights of Harlem. He didn't explode. He didn't reach for his coat or his .38. He just watched the street. A silver cane. And the store called him by name. "The manager called him Mr. Peton," Ruthie whispered. "Charles Peton." Bumpy nodded slowly. "Charles Peton III. Real estate. Money that goes back to the Dutch. He thinks he owns the ground we walk on." He turned back to his wife, his eyes like two pieces of cold flint. "Go wash up Mayme. Fix some dinner. I'm going to make a few phone calls. By the time this is over, Mr. Peton is going to wish he'd never learned how to speak." The word went out through the streets of Harlem like a lightning strike. Bumpy didn't call his shooters. He didn't call the young lions who were itching for a war with the downtown elites. Instead, he called a man named Theodore Green, his personal attorney, and a man who knew the inside of a ledger book better than he knew the Bible. "Theo," Bumpy said when the lawyer picked up, "I need a full workup on Charles Peton III. I don't want to know where he lives. I want to know who he owes. I want to know which banks hold his notes, which properties are under-leveraged, and which of his tenants are tired of living with rats while he buys silver canes. I want it by midnight." "Bumpy, that's a big fish," Green cautioned. "Peton's got friends in the mayor's office. He's got the banks in his pocket. Then we'll just have to empty his pockets, won't we? Bumpy replied. He touched my family, Theo. In the old days, I'd have his head in a bag, but it's 1964. I want to see him beg for a dime on the same street where he insulted my wife. By the next morning, Bumpy's war room wasn't a back room in a social club. It was a sophisticated command center. He knew Peton had a $9 million loan coming due with Chase Manhattan. He knew Peton was trying to acquire a new block of buildings in the Upper West Side that required a clean reputation and a massive influx of cash. Bumpy sat at his desk, a glass of scotch untouched beside him as he began to move his pieces across the board. The first move was the financial pressure. Bumpy had spent decades cultivating relationships, not just with the underworld, but with the silent money of New York, the black businessmen, the church leaders, and the few white bankers who knew that a word from Bumpy Johnson was worth more than a gold bar. He made 3 calls. By noon, 2 major investment groups quietly signaled to Chase Manhattan that they were reconsidering their deposits if the bank continued to back unstable and socially toxic developers like Peton. Then came the boots on the ground. Bumpy didn't send thugs, he sent organizers. He funneled a staggering amount of cash, nearly $50,000 in 1964 money directly into the hands of CORE and the NAACP. But it wasn't a blind donation, it was targeted. I want 500 people in front of Peton's flagship properties, Bumpy told the organizers. I want signs. I want the press. I want the world to know that the man who builds luxury apartments spends his weekends harassing women and children on Fifth Avenue. I want him to be the face of everything that's wrong with this city. By 48 hours in, the pressure was mounting. Peton's phone wouldn't stop ringing. His lawyers were telling him that the banks were suddenly getting cold feet on his $9 million bridge loan. They were re-evaluating his risk profile. In a smoky office downtown, Peton was pacing the floor, his silver cane clicking rhythmically against the wood. "Who is doing this?" he roared at his assistant. "It's a couple of picketers. Who cares about some Negroes with signs?" "It's not just signs, sir," the assistant stammered. "The tenants in your Bronx buildings, they've formed a union. They're holding a rent strike starting tomorrow. They're claiming the buildings are uninhabitable. And the press just got a leaked transcript of your incident at the boutique. The New York Post is running it on the front page tomorrow." Peton froze. The boutique. "How did they?" "The manager spoke, sir. Apparently, a friend of the store suggested it would be in his best interest to tell the truth. The friend, of course, was one of Bumpy's associates who had paid the manager a visit with a very simple choice: lose your job and your teeth, or lose Mr. Peton as a client. The manager chose his teeth. But Bumpy wasn't finished. The third front of the attack was social ostracization. Bumpy knew the elite lived for their clubs and their reputation. He made sure the board of directors at the Union League Club and the Westchester Country Club received copies of the same reports. He made sure the wives of the board members knew exactly what Peton had said to a mother and her child. In the world of the 1960s elite, you could be a shark, you could be a thief, but you couldn't be a public embarrassment. By the 72-hour mark, Charles Peton III was a man standing on a crumbling pier. His credit was frozen, his properties were under siege by rent-striking tenants and civil rights lawyers, and his name was mud in every dining room from Wall Street to Greenwich. That's when Bumpy sent Theodore Green to deliver the final message. The meeting took place in Peton's own office, but Peton looked like a man who hadn't slept in a week. He was disheveled, his tie crooked, staring at a stack of legal notices that threatened to dismantle everything his father and grandfather had built. Theodore Green walked in, calm and professional, carrying a single manila envelope. He sat down across from Peton without being asked. "Who are you?" Peton hissed. "Are you with the bank? I told them the money is coming." "I'm not with the bank, Mr. Peton," Green said, sliding the envelope across the desk. I'm here on behalf of a concerned citizen of Harlem, a man who believes in the value of respect. Peton opened the envelope. Inside was a photograph. It wasn't a photo of a hitman or a weapon. It was a photo of Mayme and Ruthie Johnson. Peton's face went white. The women from the store. What is this? Is this a shakedown? I'll call the police. Green smiled, and it was a cold, clinical thing. You could do that, but the police won't help you with your debt-to-income ratio. They won't help you with the fact that 3 of your primary lenders just decided you're a liability, and they certainly won't help you with the rent strike that's costing you $20,000 a day. Green leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. The man I represent doesn't want your money, Mr. Peton. He has plenty of his own. He wanted you to learn a lesson. He wanted you to understand that the world you knew is dead. You thought you could insult those women because you thought they were nobody. You were wrong. You insulted the family of Ellsworth Johnson. And in this city, that is a very expensive mistake. Peton slumped back into his leather chair, the silver cane slipping from his hand and clattering to the floor. Bumpy Johnson, the gangster. He prefers businessmen, Green corrected. And right now, his business is making sure you understand one thing. Racism is now a luxury you can no longer afford. You're going to lose about $34 million by the time the dust settles. Your reputation is gone. Your clubs have revoked your memberships. You're a pariah. What does he want? Peton wheezed. What do I have to do to make it stop? Nothing, Green said, standing up. It's already done. The wheels are in motion. You've been liquidated, Mr. Peton, not by a bullet, but by your own arrogance. Mr. Johnson just wanted you to know why it happened. He wanted you to feel every penny as it leaves your bank account. 1 week later, the air on Fifth Avenue was just as cold, and the boutique still smelled of expensive French perfume. The heavy glass doors swung open, and Mayme and Ruthie Johnson walked back in. The atmosphere was different this time. The manager, the same man who had stood by while Peton screamed his insults, practically sprinted across the floor. He was bowing, his hands fluttering nervously. Mrs. Johnson, a pleasure to see you again, the manager stammered. Please, come this way. We have a private room set aside. We've received several new shipments from Paris that I think you'll find exceptional. The other shoppers, the women in pearls and the men in tailored suits, didn't turn their heads away this time. They watched with a mix of awe and a new, sharp kind of fear. They had heard what happened to Peton. They had seen the empire of a titan vanish in 3 days. They realized that the rules had changed. Mayme looked at the manager, her expression serene and untouchable. The coat we were looking at last week, she said quietly. Is it still available? It is a gift from the house, Mrs. Johnson, the manager said, his voice trembling. With our deepest apologies for the misunderstanding during your last visit. Mayme didn't smile. She didn't need to. She just nodded and allowed the manager to lead them toward the velvet chairs. Outside, parked at the curb in a black Cadillac that looked like a shark in a koi pond, Bumpy Johnson sat in the back seat. He was reading a book of poetry, a cigar unlit between his fingers. He didn't look at the store. He didn't need to see the victory. He knew the score. The fallout for Charles Peton III was total. He tried to sue, he tried to fight, but Bumpy's legal and financial web was too tight. The banks called in his loans, and when he couldn't pay, they began seizing his assets. The board of his own company voted him out to save their own skins. He spent the next few years in a downward spiral of litigation and debt, eventually retreating to a small house in the suburbs, a fraction of the man he once was. He died in the late 60s, a footnote in the real estate history of New York, forgotten by the elite circles he once dominated. But the impact of those 72 hours lasted far longer than Peton's career. Word spread through the high-end retail districts of Manhattan. The story of the king of Harlem taking down a billionaire for a slur became a cautionary tale, whispered in the back rooms of Tiffany's, Saks, and Bergdorf Goodman. They realized that the Civil Rights Act wasn't just a piece of paper signed in Washington. It was a new reality backed by men who had the power to make discrimination the most expensive mistake a business could make. Bumpy Johnson didn't change the world with a speech. He didn't lead a march. He used the tools of the system that tried to exclude him to dismantle one of its architects. He showed New York that the untold legend wasn't just about who could pull a trigger, but who could play the game better than the men who invented it. As the Cadillac pulled away from the curb of Fifth Avenue, heading back uptown toward the streets where he was king, Bumpy finally lit his cigar. He looked at Mayme, who was holding a shopping bag embossed with the boutique's gold logo. "Did you get what you wanted, Mayme?" he asked. She looked at him, and for the first time in a week, the tension was gone from her face. "Yes, Ellsworth. I think I got exactly what I wanted." Bumpy nodded, blowing a cloud of blue smoke into the cool October air. "Good," he said, "because in this life you either have respect or you have nothing, and as long as I'm breathing, nobody takes that from a Johnson." The car crossed 110th Street, leaving the marble and perfume of downtown behind. They were back in Harlem, back in the kingdom Bumpy built with blood and brains. And on Fifth Avenue, the store owners watched the street a little more closely, finally understanding that the man from Harlem wasn't just a ghost in the shadows. He was the one holding the checkbook, and he was always keeping score. That was the legend of 1964. Not a war of bullets, but a war of wills. A reminder that sometimes the most devastating move you can make isn't taking a man's life. It is taking everything that made him think he was better than you. And Bumpy Johnson, the man who mastered the art of the long game, knew that better than anyone who ever walked the streets of New York.